The wind carried dust like ashes from an old fire, whispering through the bones of Red Hollow, Arizona Territory, 1889. Once it had been a proud mining town, its streets alive with the clatter of boots and the clang of picks against rock. Now the mines were empty, the saloon's piano long since silenced, and the only thing that moved with purpose was the wind. It sang through cracked shutters, over weathered gravestones, and down the single dirt road that cut through the heart of the town like a scar. Folks said Red Hollow had one thing keeping it alive: a man taller than any other, quiet as a ghost, and stronger than the drought itself. Sheriff Eli Gage. Some said he'd once wrestled a wild horse to the ground barehanded. Others swore he'd broken up a lynch mob with just a stare. But those who lived under his watch knew the truth. Eli Gage didn't need to prove his power. He carried it in his silence. He was a mountain of a man, built from iron and patience, with shoulders broad enough to shade a doorway. His eyes, gray as river stones, never gave away more than they had to. He spoke little, smiled rarely, and carried his revolver low on his right hip, not as a threat, but as a reminder. Men didn't test him. They just didn't. On most days, he could be found leaning against the rail outside his office, one boot propped up, the brim of his hat low against the sun. The badge on his chest had dulled with time, but the respect behind it hadn't. He kept the peace not by shouting orders or waving his gun, but by standing still when others ran. He was the kind of lawman whose calm made men rethink their sins. And then there was Clara Moore. She worked at the telegraph office across from the sheriff's station, a small wooden building that smelled of paper, ink, and the faintest trace of lavender. Clara had hair the color of dry wheat, and eyes that could hold your gaze the way a flame holds 'em off. She wasn't young, not anymore, but she had the kind of beauty that comes from surviving things. The town called her the Wire Girl, but to Eli, she was the one quiet place left in the world that didn't echo. Their bond was not loud. It wasn't spoken in public or sealed with promises. It lived in small gestures, her bringing him coffee when the mornings turned cold, him fixing her porch steps when no one was looking. When their eyes met across the street, words didn't need to travel. That day had begun like most others, sun like a hammer, wind scraping grit across the ground. Eli had spent the morning settling a land dispute between two ranchers who didn't want to fight, but felt they had to. He'd handled it the way he handled everything, with few words and a stare that made a man reconsider his pride. By noon, the town had retreated into shade. The sky pulsed with heat, the church bell silent, the blacksmith's hammer still. Eli walked his usual patrol down Main Street, tipping his hat to the widow Jensen, nodding at young Tommy, who swept outside the mercantile. It was the same rhythm Red Hollow had known for years, quiet, steady, predictable, until the first rumor rode in. It came with a mail rider out of Yuma, a dust-caked boy who wouldn't even stop for water before blurting it out. "Sheriff, they say the Breen boys are loose again. Broke out near Bisbee." The name hung in the air like smoke. The Breen gang, 5 brothers born of the border and raised on gunpowder. Eli had put them in irons himself 3 years back after a bloody shootout at Dry Creek. 2 men had died that night, 1 deputy, 1 Breen. The eldest brother, Jeb, had sworn from the jailhouse floor that he'd come back for the sheriff one day. Eli took the letter from the rider's hand, eyes scanning the telegram's brief message. The marshal's office confirmed the escape. Approach with caution. Consider them armed and seeking vengeance. He folded the paper neatly, slid it into his coat pocket, and simply said, "Thank you, son." The boy waited for more, a command, a reaction, but Eli gave none. He walked back toward his office as though he'd just received a grocery list, not a death threat. By sundown, the town had gone quiet. Not the usual quiet, the fearful kind. Doors locked early, windows went dark. Even the saloon shut its doors, something it hadn't done since the cholera year. Men who usually lingered on porches slipped inside, without a word. Red Hollow was holding its breath. Clara stayed late in her office, tapping messages through the telegraph lines that hummed like nervous nerves across the desert. Each time the key clicked, she paused, listening, half expecting a reply that would never come. She could feel it too, the stillness that wasn't peace. When Eli walked in near dusk, She looked up and caught that look in his eyes. Calm, distant, ready. She knew it the way you know a storm before it hits. "You heard?" she asked quietly. He nodded once. "They're coming." She swallowed hard. "And you?" Eli took off his hat, brushed the dust from the brim. "I'll be here." There was nothing else to say. He turned to leave, and as he reached the door, she said his name, not to stop him, just to hold it once more in the air. "Eli." He paused, turned slightly. Promise me, you won't go looking for them." He gave her that half-smile she both loved and hated, gentle, weary, too kind for the world around him. "No need," he said. "They'll find me." That night, the wind came down from the hills, thick with heat and whispers. The desert sky glowed red over the horizon, as if some far-off fire had set the edge of the world ablaze. Eli stood outside the sheriff's office, lanterns dim, the town asleep behind shuttered windows. He leaned against the porch rail, one boot crossed over the other, the wooden boards groaning under his weight. The cigar between his fingers glowed like a tiny ember in the night. He drew in slow, let the smoke curl upward into the dark, where stars burned faint and far apart. His gaze drifted beyond the rooftops, to the distant horizon, where the desert met the sky in a jagged line. Out there, just barely visible in the dying light, rose a thin haze of dust, too steady, too uniform to be wind. He knew the look of a trail made by riders, 5, maybe 6, moving slow, confident. The Breen brothers were coming. He said nothing, didn't move, just stood there watching as the red of the sunset bled into black. The town behind him would sleep uneasy, but Eli Gage stayed on that porch long after the stars took over the sky, the ember of his cigar the only light left in Red Hollow. And as the night wind curled around him, carrying the faint echo of distant hooves, he exhaled and whispered to himself, so soft only the dust could hear. The thunder rolled low across the plains, a slow growl that crawled along the dirt and seeped into the bones of Red Hollow. The storm wasn't here yet, but it was coming, same as the men who rode with it. Evening light bled into the horizon, staining the clouds a dark, feverish red. By the time the first hoofbeats echoed through the valley, the town had already gone still. Doors closed, lamps dimmed, hearts held their breath. They came out of the dusk like wolves, 5 shadows on horseback, faces wrapped in grit and leather, their coats torn from the road. The Breen gang. Their boots were caked with the filth of 3 states, their rifles slung across their backs like broken promises. The horses snorted steam into the cooling air, and the sound of their spurs was the only rhythm left in the street. The lead rider, Jeb Breen, had a scar that split his jaw in 2 and eyes so pale they seemed colorless. He grinned as he reined in at the edge of the main street, spitting into the dirt. "Hell of a ghost town," he muttered, glancing around. "Looks like the big man's done scared everyone half to death." His brothers laughed, mean, high laughter that bounced off the silent buildings. They rode on, slow and deliberate, past the blacksmith shop, past the empty mercantile. The only thing that moved was the hanging sign of the saloon, creaking in the wind. When they reached it, Jeb swung down from his horse, boots sinking into the mud. "Let's wake the place up," he said. The saloon door slammed open with a kick, and the piano inside gave a single broken note before dying again. The few souls who had dared to stay inside, the barkeep, a card dealer, 2 drifters, froze as the gang stormed in. Mud and dust trailed behind them like a second skin. Jeb's youngest brother, Wade, fired a shot into the ceiling, sending plaster raining down. "Where's the whiskey, old man?" he barked at the bartender. The old man's hands shook as he poured. "You Breen boys?" he asked softly. Jeb grinned. "That's right. Tell your sheriff his ghosts are here." They drank, shouted, and shot at the ceiling again just to hear the sound. The saloon filled with the sour smell of gunpowder and spilled liquor. Outside, the horses stamped in the mud, restless. The wind hissed through the shutters like it was warning the town to stay asleep. Across the street, the sheriff's office sat in silence. The only light inside came from a small lamp burning low on Eli Gage's desk. He sat alone, hat in his lap, his eyes fixed on the bullet scar that marred the wall behind him. A small, dark pit, surrounded by years of faded paint. The mark had been there since the night he'd taken the Breens down the first time. A reminder that violence never really leaves a place. It just buries itself until someone digs it up again. He reached for the cigar on the desk, but didn't light it. Not yet. Outside, the laughter from the saloon rose like thunder before dying again. He could picture them in there, drunk on hate and memory. But he didn't move. Not yet. A few buildings away, Clara Moore sat at her telegraph desk, the glow of the oil lamp soft against her face. Her fingers tapped the key, sending a message through the wire that stretched across the wilderness. She was trying to reach the U.S. Marshal's post in Yuma, but the line had gone silent halfway through her message. She tried again. Nothing. Just dead air. The wire was cold. Her stomach turned. Someone had cut it. She rose, pulling her shawl tight, and stepped to the window. Through the glass, she could see the saloon's faint light flickering, hear faint laughter that made her skin crawl. She hesitated, then slipped her revolver into her bag, a small, old thing Eli had given her once, just in case. When she stepped into the street, the night met her with silence. The air smelled of rain that hadn't fallen yet, and the wind tugged gently at her hair. Every step she took echoed too loud. She was halfway to her home when she heard the boots. 5 pairs, heavy and dragging, coming from the saloon. "Evening, Miss Moore," came a voice she remembered from 3 years ago, deep and sharp like a knife scraping stone. "You still keep the wires humming for the law." Her breath caught. Jeb Breen stepped into the lantern light, his grin wide and wrong. His brothers fanned out around her, circling like coyotes. The metallic click of revolvers broke the stillness. "I was hoping we'd find you," Jeb said. "Figured the sheriff's woman would come wandering sooner or later." "I'm not his," she began, but he cut her off with a laugh. "Don't lie, ma'am. Everyone in this town knows what keeps the big man anchored." He tilted his hat, his pale eyes narrowing. "Now where is he? Hiding in that office of his? Or maybe he's running, scared like the rest of these ghosts." Her hand gripped her bag tighter, feeling the small weight of the revolver. "You don't need to do this," she said softly. Wade Breen snorted. "Lady, we've been needing this since the day your man put us in chains." The circle tightened. She stepped back until her heel hit the edge of the well. The lantern above them flickered in the wind, and for a heartbeat, all was still except the groaning of the rope and bucket swaying beside her. "Guess the giant ain't so big without his gun," Jeb said, lowering his revolver until it pointed straight at her chest. The wind stopped. The air thickened. Then, from the far side of the street, a small flame bloomed, a single spark against the dark. The scratch of a match, faint but sharp. A shape stepped from the shadows, tall as a gallows post, calm as the desert night. Eli Gage struck his match to a cigar, the glow illuminating the lines on his face, the steady steel of his eyes. He didn't draw his gun, didn't say a word. He just stood there, the faint smoke curling upward like a ghost made of fire and patience. The gang turned toward him, half amused, half uneasy. Wade laughed first. "Well, look who's come to die proper." Eli took a slow drag from his cigar, the ember flaring, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. He exhaled, smoke curling between the outlaws and the woman they surrounded. "Boys," he said, his voice even and low, carrying farther than a shout, "put those guns down before I forget the man I've been trying to be." No one moved. The rain began to fall, soft at first, tapping against hat brims and holsters. The lantern's light shimmered across the wet dirt. Jeb's grin faltered just slightly. "You gonna kill us all over again, Sheriff?" Eli's eyes narrowed. "You already did that yourselves." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The thunder did it for him. In the stillness that followed, the sound of his cigar crackling seemed louder than the storm. And for the first time since the Breen brothers rode in, the laughter stopped. The night, the rain, the town, they all seemed to wait, holding their breath for what was about to come. The world seemed to stop spinning. The air hung thick between them, heavy with rain and gunpowder waiting to breathe. The lanterns swayed in the wind, their dim light flickering against wet boards and trembling hands. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft hiss of rain hitting the roofs and the slow, rhythmic click of Jeb Breen's thumb against his revolver's hammer. Eli Gage stood motionless, a statue cut from shadow and firelight. The cigar burned steady between his fingers, its ember reflected in his eyes. Clara stood frozen near the well, her breath shallow, her eyes darting between the outlaws and the man who seemed to hold the night itself in his stillness. The wind shifted, carrying the metallic scent of gun oil, sweat, and fear. A church bell, long rusted, gave a single dull chime in the distance before silence swallowed it whole. Jeb smirked, his voice like gravel dragged across tin. "Ain't much of a sheriff if he don't draw first," he said. "What's wrong, Giant? Hands too slow now. Maybe that war you bragged about broke you." Eli didn't answer. He took a long, quiet pull from his cigar and let the smoke drift from his mouth like a sigh. His gaze moved slowly over each man, reading their stances, the tremor in their knuckles, the twitch in their boots. The ground beneath his feet was soft with rain, and he could smell the earth giving way to the storm. "You boys ever bury a man in mud?" he asked softly. Jeb's laughter broke the air. "What? You gonna preach us to death, preacher man?" Eli's eyes flicked to Clara, and his voice grew quieter, colder. "I've buried men. Too many. Some I shot, some I couldn't save. But every time, I told myself I'd never be the first to pull again." He paused, the weight of the years behind him pressing against the air. "Problem is, the world don't give a damn about promises." The youngest Breen brother, Wade, spat into the dirt. "Enough of this talk," he said, raising his revolver. "Let's put the giant down." "Don't," Eli said. "One word. Low. Final." But Wade's hand didn't stop. The hammer cocked. Eli's voice rolled through the street like thunder caught in a canyon. "Clara," he said, never looking her way. "Step behind the light." She froze. "What?" He didn't move his eyes from the gang. Behind the lamp. In the shadow. She understood then. It was something from before, his war days. A trick soldiers used to break a shooter's sight line. She took one step, then another, vanishing into the dark behind the flickering lamp post. The outlaws laughed. "You think hiding her'll save you?" Jeb taunted. Eli dropped his cigar into the mud, the ember hissing out in the rain. He straightened his back, boots planted firm, his coat heavy with water. His hand hovered near his gun, not shaking, not tense, just waiting. "You wanted me," he said. "Now you got me." For a moment, the whole world held its breath. Then came the first flash. The roar of gunfire split the night, sharp and violent, bouncing off the walls like rolling thunder. Horses screamed in their stalls, windows shattered, lamps swung wildly. The storm broke loose with it, rain slashing down in sheets, thunder cracking open the sky. Eli moved before the eye could follow. His revolver barked 3 times, each shot crisp, each one finding flesh. The youngest fell first, twisting into the mud before his weapon even hit the ground. The second went down clutching his chest, eyes wide with disbelief. The third staggered backward into the saloon door, splintering it open before collapsing under its frame. Smoke filled the street, thick and swirling. Eli's shape flickered between lightning flashes, the muzzle of his revolver glowing like the eyes of a storm god. His expression never changed, calm, sorrowful, deadly. Jeb shouted orders, voice cracking. "Spread out. Hit him from both sides." But his men were already gone. Only one brother remained beside him, pale and trembling, blood slicking his sleeve. The surviving man turned to run. He didn't make it 2 steps. One final shot cracked the air, and he dropped without a sound. Now only Jeb Breen stood, soaked and shaking, his revolver still in hand. He wiped rain from his face and stared into the smoke that drifted like ghosts through the street. He couldn't see Eli, but he could feel him, out there, silent, breathing, waiting. "Come on then," Jeb screamed. "You think you can kill all of us and walk away?" Lightning flashed. In that blink of white light, Eli stepped from the haze, revolver at his side, smoke rising from its barrel. His coat clung to him, drenched, his hat dripping. The cigar was gone, but the faint trace of its smoke still hung around him. Jeb stumbled back, firing wildly. Bullets tore through rain and air, but Eli didn't flinch. Each shot missed, slamming into wood and glass. When the hammer clicked empty, Jeb froze. The silence after the gunfire was louder than the shots themselves. Rain pattered against metal and flesh alike. Eli's boots echoed through puddles as he walked forward, slow, deliberate, unhurried. Jeb's hands shook as he tried to reload, fumbling the bullets. You ain't human," he stammered. Eli's voice was a whisper in the storm. "No, just tired." He stopped 3 paces away. "You came for blood," he said, "so you'll leave without a heartbeat." Jeb looked up, eyes wide. "You wouldn't." Eli raised his gun. The sound that followed was final. One shot that cracked the silence of Red Hollow and carried through the canyons for miles. Jeb's body crumpled into the mud beside his brother's, the rain washing red into the dirt. When the echoes faded, there was nothing left but the storm. The clock inside the saloon ticked faintly, marking the seconds between life and legend. Smoke lingered, swirling around the lamplight, curling around Eli like an old companion. He lowered his revolver, holstered it, and reached down to pick up the cigar that had fallen earlier. He relit it with a match, the tiny flame trembling in the wind. Clara stepped from the shadows, her face pale and wet with rain. She looked at the bodies, then at him, at the man who'd stood still while death moved around him. He didn't meet her eyes right away. He took a long drag from the cigar, the glow painting his face in orange. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though her lips trembled. "You." He shook his head. "Don't," he said softly. "Don't say it." For a long moment, they stood there, surrounded by smoke and rain and silence. The west itself seemed to pause, listening. Then, somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, low and fading, like the world exhaling after holding its breath too long. Eli turned toward the horizon, where dawn was just beginning to bleed into the clouds. He looked down at the cigar, at the faint trail of smoke curling upward, and whispered almost to himself, "Never first, but always last." The rain eased to a drizzle. The dust settled into mud, and Red Hollow, for the first time in years, went truly silent. Dawn crept slow over Red Hollow, turning the rain-soaked street into a mirror of gold and blood. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy and clean, the world still in the quiet that follows violence. Smoke rose in thin ribbons from broken lamps, curling into the morning light like tired ghosts returning home. Sheriff Eli Gage stood in the center of the street, his broad shoulders hunched, his revolver lowered at his side. Steam rose from the barrel, his breath steady but deep. All around him lay the remains of the night. 5 men sprawled in mud and rainwater, their guns silent, their laughter gone. The Breen brothers were finished. Clara came to him slowly, her steps careful on the wet boards. Her dress was soaked, her hair clinging to her face, but her hands did not tremble. She took his arm gently, guiding him toward the porch of the sheriff's office. For the first time since the gunfire, he let her. He sat on the steps, the cigar still between his fingers, now cold and dark. His right hand shook as he tried to light it again, but the match refused to catch. Clara knelt before him, her fingers wrapping around his wrist. There was blood beneath his sleeve, a long, shallow cut from a glancing bullet. "You're hurt," she whispered. "Just a scratch," he said, but the exhaustion in his voice betrayed him. He'd carried the night on his shoulders, and it had taken something from him that words couldn't name. She tore a strip from her shawl and wrapped his hand, tying it firm. "You move like you've done this before," she said softly. "Not like a man who keeps the peace, but one who's made war." For a long time, he didn't answer. The sun began to rise higher, painting his face in pale light, showing the lines that years of silence had carved. Finally, he looked at her. "I have," he said. "A long time ago." She waited, sensing this was something he'd never spoken aloud. The wind lifted a piece of his coat, revealing the faded outline of a patch sewn inside. An eagle, worn and frayed by time. "I was Sergeant Elijah Gage," he said at last. "Union sharpshooter, 3rd Kansas Infantry." His gaze drifted toward the horizon, as if the memory lived out there still. "I fought through the war, saw men turn to smoke and earth. I was good at it, too good. After Appomattox, I swore I'd never draw a gun first again. Never kill another man unless I had no choice. Clara's throat tightened. And the Breen gang. They were soldiers once, Eli said. Confederate raiders. Mean, wild, angry the war was over. After it ended, they turned outlaw. 3 years ago, they hit a supply train near Prescott. Killed 6 men under my command. Men I trained. Boys mostly. I caught them after. Sent them to Yuma. Thought that was the end. He paused, eyes narrowing as he looked toward the edge of town. But some debts take longer to collect. The words hung there in the light between them, heavy as the smell of wet dust and smoke. By mid-morning, the town began to wake. Doors creaked open, faces appeared in windows. The people of Red Hollow stepped out one by one, their fears slowly giving way to something else. Wonder, disbelief, maybe even pride. Men took off their hats. Women crossed themselves. No one spoke loud, no one dared. The bodies of the Breen brothers were gathered and carried to the ridge outside town. Eli led the wagon himself, his horse moving slow through the mud. Clara walked beside it, her hand resting lightly on the wooden edge. When they reached the ridge, he climbed down, shoveling the earth himself, while the townsfolk stood back in silence. No markers, no names. Just 5 stones laid in a line beneath the mesquite trees, the wind already smoothing the dirt. When the last one was set, Eli stood over them for a long while, his hat in his hand, his face unreadable. Clara stepped closer. "You could have left them," she said. "You didn't have to do this." He looked down at the graves. "Every man deserves a place to rest," he said quietly. "Even devils." The sun climbed higher, and with it came life. Hammers rang from the blacksmith's yard as doors were mended. Children ran in the street again, laughing, chasing puddles. The saloon reopened by noon, its piano coughing out a hesitant tune. Fear, for once, had loosened its grip on Red Hollow. By evening, the sheriff's badge on Eli's chest had caught the orange light of sunset again. He stood outside his office, cigar lit at last, smoke curling lazily upward. Clara joined him, a cup of coffee in her hands, watching the colors shift across the desert. "You think they'll come again?" she asked. Eli took a slow drag, exhaled. "No," he said. "Word travels fast out here. The West remembers its stories." A long silence passed between them, broken only by the sound of distant laughter and the creak of a sign swinging in the wind. Clara turned to him, her eyes soft. "And you?" He smiled faintly, the kind that carried both weariness and peace. "Me? I'm just tired of ghosts." She reached for his hand, still bandaged but steady, and he let her hold it. Together, they watched the last light fade behind the ridge, where 5 nameless graves lay hidden in shadow. As darkness settled once more, the voice of the wind returned to the valley, whispering through fences and rafters, carrying with it a story that would outlive them both. They say that night changed Red Hollow forever, that the town slept sound for the first time in years, that the sheriff who stood in the rain and faced 5 armed men without trembling became a legend whispered from campfire to saloon across the frontier. Some men, they said, brought peace with a Bible, others with a badge. But when the giant sheriff lit his cigar that night and the Breen gang fell, the West went silent, silent as a prayer, and it never forgot his name.